Hi, I'm Luke Pape, and I'm asking if students actually know about the Electoral College. So for starters, back in the 2016 election, we saw President Trump win the Electoral College vote and consequently the presidency, while Hillary Clinton won the popular vote. And this caused a massive outrage because lots of people thought that Clinton should have won the presidency because she had more actual votes than President Trump did. And after this election, I remember talking with my friends and classmates, and a lot of them were having false definitions of what the Electoral College actually is, and they were making false assumptions based on those definitions. So to clear the air on that, we need to define what the Electoral College is. So the Electoral College is defined as a body of electors that are appointed through their state governments to cast their vote for president and vice president. Now the next definition is faithless electors. These are those same electors who go through and they combine the votes of the popular vote within their state government, put forth their vote towards the Electoral College in a way that is not representative of what the state actually wants. An example of this is the state voting for a Republican candidate and the elector voting for a Democratic candidate, so it's a little controversy there. That brings us to the significance of my research. This research hopefully will provide an avenue for explaining the extremely low voter turnout for the 18 to 29 age group, and it will also explain a reason for why that is and other resources that can be allocated to fix that issue. And the problem statement. So a lot of students do not know what they're talking about when they're mentioning the Electoral College, as I mentioned before, and they're not taking that government class in a way which will help them prepare for those elections once they turn 18. And if they have not taken that government class, they don't have enough prior knowledge for what their vote actually counts towards and what it means. So they don't have enough knowledge there to make an accurate decision on what they want to vote for. And as you can see, the blue line here represents the 18 to 29 age group, and it peaks right around 50% on presidential election years compared to 75% for the 16 and up age group. And each age group consequently goes up in voter participation based on their divisions. So that brings me to my research question of how does a high school student's knowledge of the Electoral College influence his or her willingness to vote? And coming to that question, I found a multitude of studies that surveyed public opinion rather than actual knowledge. And when you have a public opinion question, you need a certain level of knowledge to actually understand what that public opinion is. And none of these encountered that. So they were all asking upper level people, current voters, and college students what their opinions were based on the Electoral College and the electoral process as a whole. So I really wanted to get in there and say, if they don't know enough about the Electoral College, how can they have an opinion on it? And the first study, the voter turnout from MIT, it explores reasons for people not voting to start out with. So some of these reasons being a lack of documentation. That lack of documentation could come at the poll. They don't have that photo ID to actually present so they can vote, or they don't have the documentation to actually register to vote. They don't have the necessary documents with them. They don't have them in general. There's just a lack of documentation there. The next barrier is a lack of transportation and financial barriers. So we currently have a day off for Election Day. A lot of people, especially low income, as you can see in the graph on the left, they don't take off to vote. They need that money to support their family, whereas higher income people don't need that money as much so they can take that day off to work. This brings us to the Pew post-election survey. This survey was a walkout survey given in the 2016 election that surveyed people about their opinions of the Electoral College. They asked questions that were open-ended and demographic questions that really got a sense of voter turnout based on race, gender, etc. And these open-ended questions were asked in a way that allowed people to question or give their opinions on what the Electoral College was, how it worked, and their opinions on the overall election. So it asked, what are your initial thoughts regarding the 2016 election? So a lot of people to use adjectives and other words to describe their feelings towards the Electoral College. The next survey, this is the real cornerstone of my research here, the Mafucci study. It's Electoral College, a system for the people. It studied knowledge-based opinion questions, so this is the kind of bridge between my gap and these actual surveys. It was a survey given at the University of Maine. It was an honors college thesis there, and it asked questions in a way that required some knowledge to answer. And so here, I noticed that a lot of these people were not answering these questions correctly at the college level. And in order to get that knowledge at the college level, we have to have it supplied before, and that comes from the high school level. And this is kind of where I got my qualifying questions from that actually test the knowledge of the students. And that brings to the hypothesis. I believe that there will be a negative influence on students' likelihood to register to vote due to that lack of knowledge. And I used a survey because the rest of these used surveys in a way that was either over the phone as they walked out or another way, but due to COVID and just being in school naturally, I had to use an email platform. So I acquired the list of AP Capstone schools, and there were roughly 200 schools on there. And so I sent my survey out to every single one of them. And I reached out to the administrators of those schools, and I asked them to survey within their school. And I provided a little synopsis of what I was studying, what the research was about, and only 17 of those ended up responding to me. And within those 17, I had 10 states reported, and I compared the results to each state to each other to see which states had the better accuracy in those qualifying questions. So the breakdown of my survey, I had 15 questions and 3 sections with the one consent question at the top. If they answered yes, they consent, they would go ahead and take the whole survey. If they said no, they would be immediately kicked out as to protect them, and since they didn't want to consent to the survey. The 3 sections, I had the opening questions, which were the demographic-based questions, and they kind of asked prequel questions to what I was actually asking, such as, do you plan on voting, or what is your name, age, etc. And the qualifying questions, this is where I asked and researched the actual knowledge base of the students. And so I use these questions to actually test what they know in a way that would allow them to express what they know in a correct manner. In the closing questions, these are the willingness to vote questions, the have you taken a government class questions, etc. So I received 80 responses, like I said before, from 17 schools in 10 states. Now, while there are more schools than there are states, that is because I had an influx of results from Missouri. You can see from this map here that Missouri had almost 40% of my data. Now, while there are 10 states here, with 3 of them having only 1 response, I had to cut some of those out a little bit. So when I compare the states to each other, I had to only use states with responses greater than 5, so that leaves the top 5 there. And while I only had 10 states, I wanted the entire country, but I couldn't get that because I didn't have those responses. So I had an even number of historically Democrat states and historically Republican states to accurately have a representation there and not just have one group that was larger than the other, henceforth the non-biased part. So this brings us to the first section of questions. I had the opening questions, which were, what is your grade and how old are you? So I typically had juniors, and they were 16 and 17 years old, which is to be expected as you were a junior. And this is where the Electoral College and the government class needs to be taught, because it is before they turn 18, before they can actually vote. So it's that prime time for them to actually get that knowledge. And this is the, are you planning on voting when you turn 18? Only 1 student said that they wouldn't. And this is important later on. That brings us to the qualifying questions. As you can see, the first one is, what is the Electoral College used for? 100% of students got that correct. And then the next one, how often is the Electoral College used? 1 student got that incorrect. This is the first inaccuracy on my qualifying questions. Now this one has the biggest spread. This is the second to last qualifying question. It asks, when the Electoral College is in play, what are you voting for, essentially? And the correct answer is actually the orange one. It is, my vote is for someone who will combine my vote with other votes and still choose to vote for who they want to. That is an example of the faithless electors, as previously mentioned. Now, only 39% got this correct. That means 61% of people answered this question incorrectly, proving that they don't have that knowledge base. And these qualifying questions, again, came back from that Mafucci study, and they were based on a high school level rather than asking them in a way that might not be as understood based on that Mafucci study at the college level. And after this question, I had another qualifying question, which I asked the students to explain what the Electoral College is in their own terms. However, being high school students, we're most likely going to take the easy way out, and a lot of these responses were copy and pasted from Google verbatim, or they were simple, I don't know, and one student even answered, the Electoral College sucks, right? So it's just, high school students, they're not going to do that efficiently, and so I didn't really get a real understanding of what they knew. However, with that, I could assume that they did not know what they were talking about since they could not provide me an accurate description. And that brings us to the closing questions. I asked students, have they taken a government class? 77% said they have. However, with them answering the qualifying questions incorrectly, they did not actually know what they were talking about. And that government class must not have been taught efficiently, or they have not been accurately exposed to the material. And when did you hear of the Electoral College? Again, 56% said at school, meaning that it was most likely through that government class in which they were taught. And this right here is the real cornerstone of my research, the last question on the survey. And it asked, does your understanding of the Electoral College influence your willingness to vote? Now, only 1 student answered that they would not vote previously, and that is synonymous with here. Only 1 student said they were not going to vote in the next election. Now, the blue, 55%, say they will vote because they have enough knowledge. However, majority of those students specifically did not know the knowledge. They didn't answer those qualifying questions correctly, despite saying that they did. And I feel like that is very characteristic of high school students because we are always right. And the next one, 35%, said they will vote because it is their constitutional right. And with that being said, they didn't answer whether or not they had that knowledge, but we can see from the data that they obviously did not. And only 10% actually admitted to being unsure. And those 10% are the ones who said they will vote even though they didn't know what they were talking about. So they were the only truthful ones in that matter. And so the survey results, 54% said that they got the qualifying questions correct, and they did. While 23% said they knew what they were talking about and got the qualifying questions correct. So that is a very small percentage there of the actual students who said they got them right while they actually did not. And previously, I had the last question. I also added one small question in there for extra comments. And this question was initially regarded as just thoughts and concerns about the survey, but a few students put in there like they don't remember the Electoral College being taught at all, they don't remember it, but that can be just not paying attention one day, obviously. And there was a few in there that were actually knowledge-based. So they were saying the Electoral College is outdated, and if they don't actually know what they're talking about, how can they make that opinion? How can they have that actual knowledge to understand what they're talking about enough to push that idea forth? And so these states right here, they're the five with at least five responses. And as previously said, Missouri had 31 responses, and that is almost 40% of my data. However, as you can tell, their accuracy ratio within the qualifying questions did not differ that much from the others. So with their influx of responses, that was not a true limitation because their accuracy ratio is pretty similar to the rest. And Arizona led the way with 90%, followed closely by New York. And here, again, we see the historically blue states compared to the historically red states, and they are pretty similar there as well. So it gets that combined nature there. That brings us to the limitations. Again, almost half my data was in one state. However, the accuracy was still there, so I didn't think of it as that much of an issue. And all my responses are public schools. I had initially wanted to survey public, private, and homeschools. However, I could not find enough private or homeschool kids in order to take my survey. And so I just kind of cut them out completely and did only public school kids. So that way I didn't have a vast majority of public schools and only like 3 or 4 private or homeschool kids. So that way I could have all of one and devote all of my focus to that one area. And not all 50 states have responded. Now, I did have a big range, so I had a lot of northeastern states, a lot of southern states, and a few mixed in there, here and there. And like I said before, they are historically blue, historically red, so I can compare that rather than just have the whole country overall. So that brings us to the conclusions. Students are going to vote despite that lack of knowledge. This is completely opposite of my previous hypothesis. And I did find that there's no correlation between education and voting. However, I would like to combine that with public and private and homeschool students to get a full knowledge base of all the types of high school education we have in this country. I would also like to have more representation of what the nation actually stands for, including all 50 states. And to do that, I would have to expand my research, have public, private, and homeschool, send multiple more emails, and I would actually have to combine them, multiply them together equally, and have them separated based on what their schools were. That is the end of my presentation. Thank you. I'd like to open the floor up for questions now.
Oral defense panel, you may start your questions.
Okay, Luke, how did you determine which results generated by your research method were most important in informing your new understanding?
So originally I had a few more questions in there that were just to gather more information about the students themselves. And they're not mentioned in this presentation because they're not as important. They are just questions like, when did you hear of the Electoral College? Was it before or after the election? And I feel like since I had mostly juniors, that didn't matter as much. And because if they were seniors, they obviously would have been putting forth their votes and knowing that, or getting that knowledge from the election itself rather than the class. And so I just figured that one wasn't as important as the rest of them would have been.
All right, Luke. What are the real-world implications or consequences related to your findings?
All right, so going back to that one graph I had where the 18 to 29 age group peaked around 50%. So 50% of our young voters are actually casting their vote, and that That's right around half. So if we only have half of our students voting, that means the other half are completely left out of what their needs are in the government. So the government cannot accurately provide the necessary tools and resources to those 50% if they're not voicing their opinions and what they need.
Question? Think back to your initial curiosity that sparked this inquiry. What other curiosities do you have, and how has this process prepared you to explore them?
So, like I said before, I would want to research the private, public, and homeschools. So, in order to get a full comprehensive study of what the nation actually needs and wants, we would have to get all types of students involved, and that would be the future direction part. We need to pit them against each other to see which one has the most knowledge. So for homeschool kids, since they don't have a traditional curriculum, we could say that they have a lesser or higher knowledge base just based on their experiences rather than their actual schooling. And so in the future, I would like to pair them against each other and also back into college, go into this and see what types of students are in college coming from private homeschool and public schools, have the students at that same school based on their different types of high school education, compare them there.
Very good, thank you so much. All right, I'd like to open the floor for additional questions or comments.
I'll ask, because you mentioned like the future, the other curiosities that you have, and then moving forward, do you plan to go into government politics or anything? Talk about that.
I won't plan on a career specific in government or politics. I'm actually planning on going into medicine, but there is kind of it's kind of equally represented there because you can't have one without the other. So there is a need to have these combined efforts there. So you can have a government class or major focused through a medical lens. So I plan on doing something of that sort.
Love it. And it is fun to just learn things.
Right.
Yeah, I agree. That's good.
We got to your slide, because
Sure.
I'm really curious about, when you were saying like 50% actually do vote, but
Oops.
then I'm really curious about where the difference is on their intention to vote. Keep going. Right there. Yeah. I think it's just interesting to
Right.
think about how many kids think they're going to vote, and then when actually presented with that opportunity, actually do.
Right, and we can attribute that to it takes a lot to register to vote now, and we're consistently, some states are making it harder, some states are making it easier, and we can pit that to the Democrat or the Republican states because of their political beliefs. However, these states, I also left this question open-ended on one platform, so it was multiple choice and an open-ended box at the end. And the blue one at the very bottom, the light blue one, says, though I'll cast my vote, it is because I don't want to, I feel it is my right. And so they're not wanting to vote, however they feel they need to because it is best for themselves and the people around them. So, there is that balance there between not wanting to and actually needing to.
Did you have data that asked, did you vote in the most present election?
I did not, because this was actually administered before the election, so I couldn't actually get that data back.
When typically, we had juniors and seniors.
Right.
In this poll. When typically is government taught? Did you ask that question? Have you taken government class? Compared to-
So I didn't ask that question directly, but a lot of the students, I compared their responses per student by question. So a lot of them have taken it in their junior year, because that was one of the questions on there. It was like, did you take it before or after the election? And so majority of them said they have taken it before the election, but a lot of them said, I think it was mostly the juniors that said they haven't taken it yet. So I could see that it was like half and half. Juniors have not taken it, have taken it. So it's kind of iffy depending on the state.
I was going to ask if you felt like that influenced
Mhm.
the results of your test. Because
Right.
if some of these students haven't taken government yet, then they haven't.
Sure.
Knowing your findings, what recommendations would you give high school government teachers in teaching the electoral college to
Sure.
their students?
Sure. So when I was doing this project originally, I looked up the AP government syllabus, and so I noticed that the Electoral College wasn't specifically mentioned. It's just electing the president. That is the one title there. And so while our high school or AP government class is a semester course, I would feel like making it longer or having just another like election process class in general might be beneficial, just because it would teach this whole process, what it means, what are the implications of certain decisions being made, and it would accurately compare to the AP classes where people can have that shorter time period and actually get more knowledge out of
So
it.
you did AP government, did you happen to look at the 10 states that were represented in those state standards for the government classes?
Well, I couldn't find all of them. I did find a few of them, and they were all pretty synonymous across the board, and they were just saying that it had to be taught. It didn't say how much had to be taught and what depth it needed to go into.
Very interesting.
Yep.
So you gave the recommendation to the high schools or to an educational institution to provide maybe an electoral process class. What specific, and you're going through government right now, so
Right.
what specific advice would you give your government teacher when teaching electoral college?
Right. So we had to take our civics test in order to graduate, and we did go over those questions, and a lot of those questions were present and about the Electoral College, and I felt prepared personally. But I do feel like we just need to go straight into what the Electoral College means, what it was originally created to do, and what it means now, compare those two, because it is vastly different now than it was before. And so I feel like we can go into what the Electoral College actually is now, rather than what it was before, because originally it was mostly about what it was originally intended to do and not what it is now.
To follow up, if I heard you correctly, you think that it should be taught in the junior year?
I do. Yep. That way you can have that knowledge before you turn 18. Yep.
Talk to us about your expert advisor.
So he is obviously sitting right behind you. But originally I'd wanted to study public opinion on the Electoral College. But like I said in those surveys, a lot of the students were answering those questions incorrectly. And I noticed that if you didn't have that knowledge, you couldn't have that. And so I was kind of back and forth. And then I originally sent my initial questions off to my expert advisor. And he kind of qualified them and said, well, these ask this, and what are you actually wanting to study? And so he really helped me formulate into what I wanted to study and get an accurate survey based off of that.
One last question. When you built your instrument, when you built your survey, what did you learn about that process? And qualifying that a little bit, let's go a little bit more in depth. Did you do a field test to determine whether or not your questions were going to be unbiased and accurate?
Sure. So, and a survey wording is everything. And so I worked with my dad, my expert advisor, a lot of other people to see if the wording was in a way that was neutral and would not sway a response. So I tested family members, a few classmates as well, just to see how it would run and see if their wording, and asked questions about the survey to see if they thought it could be changed in either way.